Stein Hain. Welcome back to Din and Daf, where we do some conceptualizing of Halakha through a case study. Our case study today is Maase Shabbat, when a Jew violates Shabbos and is interested in using the object that was changed or formed through their violation of Shabbos, or another Jew is interested in using that object, right? Let's say I cooked something on Shabbos, God forbid, I violated Shabbos. So that's our kind of case, and it comes up in Bava Kama, Ayin Aleph, Amud Aleph. And the question essentially is, can you allow people to use things that were created, forged through a violation of Shabbos? And of course, the idea is we want to deter people from violating Shabbos, or you might even think the object itself has some element of, just being forbidden. It's not just a deterrence to keep people from violating Shabbos, but it's actually the item itself has some, almost kedusha in sort of a negative way. It was created through violation of Shabbos. Don't touch that. Don't go near that. But either way, what's interesting is that in the discussion, or one of the things that's interesting is that in the discussion of this question, what we see when we look at different sources around Shas, and even in the Yerushalmi, especially in the Yerushalmi, I should say, is we find that the decision about whether to be lenient or to be strict about allowing people to use something that was forged through Shabbos violation is not just a simple matter of, well, halachically, technically, what is permitted or forbidden. It seems that Chazal, at least some rabbis, also take into account, if we paskin one way, will that lead people to be too lenient about Shabbos, to try to exploit what we say? Should there be certain people where we paskin more strictly to keep them from exploiting a leniency or from being lax with Shabbos? And I really like this issue because I think it takes into account a big question about law. How much does law think about the people whose lives are shaped by it and what those people are likely to do or not to do in response to a law? How those people are likely to react, whether it's realistic that the standards that are set will actually be maintained, and how much do you take that into account? So I think it's a great meta halakhic question. So let's jump in, starting with Bava Kama Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, where we do see three approaches to what do you do about Maase Shabbat, meaning the item that was created or forged through the violation of Shabbos. Which Jews, if any, would be permitted to use it, and when? So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, let's see. So it goes like this. Ditnan, as we learn in a Mishnah, and the truth is the Mishnah doesn't have all of this. It only has part of this. It's actually a Breita that has all of what we're about to see. But Ditnan, hamivashel b'Shabbat, one who cooks on Shabbos, of course, a violation of Torah law. B'shogeg yochal, if they did so unwittingly, they didn't know it was Shabbos, they didn't know it was usher to cook, one or the other. Yochal, they can eat it even on Shabbos. Very lenient. B'mezid lo yochal. But if they did it on purpose, they knew it was Shabbos, they knew this was usher, they cannot eat from it. And Rashi explains, on Shabbos they can't eat from it, nor can anyone else. But after Shabbos, they can, and so can other people. Divi Rabbi Meir, this is Rabbi Meir's approach. Pretty lenient, actually, right? Doesn't make this thing totally verboten. Even if it's b'shogeg, you can even eat it on Shabbos, even the person who violated Shabbos. If it's b'mezid, it's true, nobody can use it on Shabbos, no Jew can use it on Shabbos, but after Shabbos, anyone can use it, including the person who violated Shabbos. It's pretty lenient. Rabbi Yehuda goes one step stricter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says, B'shogeg yochal b'motzei Shabbat. He says, listen, you do it by accident, meaning you don't know it's Shabbos, you didn't know it was Asur to cook. You can't use it on Shabbos, but you can use it after Shabbos. Okay, you can use it after Shabbos, as can others, said Rashi. Rashi also says others can't use it on Shabbos either, right? Rabbi Yehuda doesn't want it used on Shabbos. But b'mezid, if you did it on purpose, nah. Lo yochal olamit, the person who did the violation should never eat it. Can never eat it. I mean, what are you doing here? Whether this is a matter of deterrence or it's a matter of the item itself just becomes verboten because Shabbos malacha was done with it, the person who violated Shabbos, you're not going to let them eat something that they purposely violated Shabbos to make. Other people, once it's Motzei Shabbos, other people can eat it. We're not going to let it go to waste, but not the person themselves. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, he is the most strict. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar Omer, no. B'shogeg, if it's b'shogeg, the person who violated Shabbos, even though it was b'shogeg, will never eat this item. Yechel motzei Shabbat la'achirim v'lolo. After Shabbos, other Jews can eat it. The person who cooked it cannot eat it. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar does not want a person who violated Shabbos, even unwittingly, ever eating from the result of that violation. And b'mezid, if a person did it on purpose, forget it. Lo yachel olamit, nobody's going to eat it ever. Lolo v'lo la'achirim. Not themselves and not somebody else, right? So you can see we have like a real spectrum here. So as you're listening to this, I wonder if you think to yourself, like, I would paskin like Rabbi Meir, I would paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, I would paskin like Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. Because the truth is, there's a lot of logic to each of them. There really is a lot of logic to each of them. But it's interesting to note that once we get to the Yerushalmi, we're going to see that there was, it wasn't just the sort of like bottom line halakha, or I don't know how to say it. It wasn't the bottom line, strict letter of the law that helps some among Chazal make a decision who to follow. It's also thinking, how are the people who we tell this to going to act as a result? But before we get to seeing that sort of meta halakhic thought process that they have, I want to note that when you look in Tanaitic literature, meaning when you look in the layer of Mishnayot, or you look in the Tosefta, companion piece to the Mishnah, right? Meaning they're parallels around the same time and contain a lot of the same material, but also different material. When you look in the Mishnayot that talk about Maseh Shabbat, it sounds like Rabbi Meir is the stam. Rabbi Meir is the basic anonymous default. When you look in the Tosefta, it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda is the basic anonymous default. And let's take a look. So the Mishnah in Shrumot has part of what was quoted in Bava Kama, but not with Rabbi Meir by name. Ha-me'aser, somebody who tithes, meaning gives a tenth of their produce, that separates a tenth of their produce, right? Or, by the way, gives truma, separates truma for the Kohen, right? Maser for the Levi, truma for the Kohen. What's wrong with doing that on Shabbos? It's essentially repairing the rest of the food that it's part of. That food isn't allowed to be eaten until maser is taken or truma is taken. So you're mitaken or mitakenet on Shabbat. You're repairing something on Shabbat, so you're not allowed to do it. But let's say you did, right? Someone is maser or mivashel or cooked b'Shabbat on Shabbos, shogeg yochal. If they did it unwittingly, they may eat from it, presumably on Shabbos itself. Mezid lo yochal. If they did it on purpose, they shouldn't eat from it. Again, presumably on Shabbos. It sounds like Rabbi Meir, right? It doesn't say Rabbi Meir's name, but it sounds like Rabbi Meir. And even more surprising, I would say, is the Mishnah in Chulin, which seems to indicate that if you violate Shabbos, even on purpose, you yourself, the violator, will at some point be able to partake of that Maseh Shabbat, which is, it's Rabbi Meir. Let's take a look. It says, Hashochet b'Shabbat u'b'Yom Kippurim, somebody who slaughters an animal on Shabbos and Yom Kippur, even though the person is now causing themselves to have to get the death penalty, meaning they did it on purpose. You don't get the death penalty if you do something in shogeg. they did it on purpose. Shchita tokshera, the shchita is kosher, right? The shchita is kosher. So who's the only person of the three, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yochanan Assemblar, who would say that in a case of mazid, this thing would be kosher, meaning it could be eaten by the violator and by other people? It's only Rabbi Meir. Yeah, you have to wait till after Shabbos, or after Yom Kippur, obviously. But sounds like Rabbi Meir, right? Again, his name is not here, but that's what it sounds like. So it sounds like the Mishnah, when you look in Shas Mishnayot, it sounds like the Nitya, the sort of leaning is towards a more Mekel Rabbi Meir. Not as much when you look at the Tosefta. Now, the Tosefta actually in Shabbos does record our whole conversation that was in Bava Kama, and then some actually, but it's anonymous. Some of its anonymous statements sound like Rabbi Yehuda. Take a look. Hasholchit b'Shabbos b'shogeg, somebody who slaughters an animal on Shabbos unwittingly, right? Parallel to this Mishnah in Chulin, but a little bit different. It's not Yom Kippur, and here it says it's shogeg, right? What happens? Yochal motzei Shabbat. They can eat it on Saturday night. It's Rabbi Yehuda. And b'mezid, if they did it on purpose, lo yochal, they can't even eat it Saturday night, right? This is Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda. Fine. So we have Mishnah looking very mekel, Tosefta looking a little bit more machmir. But by the way, we haven't seen a representation in any anonymous statement in the Sifrut Tanait, in Tanaitic literature, that's as machmir as Rabbi Yochanan Assemblar, right? But wait for it. Here comes the Yerushalmi, because Rav likes Rabbi Yochanan Assemblar, and we're going to see why. So Rav, the Babylonian Amora, Kadhavi Moribav Chaburate, Mori Rabbi Meir, when he was teaching his students, meaning when he was ruling for his students, right? More is also More Hora'ah. He's ruling for his students. He ruled like Rabbi Meir. He ruled the most mekel, right? But Bitzibure, but in public, who do you rule like? Rabbi Yochanan Assemblar, the most machmir. Isn't that interesting? It's like he's taking into account who he's talking to. When I'm talking to my students who I know are very machmir on Shabbos observance, they're going to be very careful. I say to them, look, you be lenient like Rabbi Meir, because that's who I really think the Halakha follows. But when I'm talking in public and I don't know who's listening to me and whether they're lax on Shabbos or not lax on Shabbos, I'm going to go with the most machmir to keep them from violating Shabbos and to let them know whether it's b'shogeg or b'mezid, you're never going to get to use it. So don't bother. Be more careful, right? So a disparity between, public policy, right? It's better public policy to say follow Rabbi Yochanan Assemblar and private dispensations. But then the conversation continues in the Yerushalmi, where people say they're curious, like, let's talk to a Chacham Eretz Yisraeli, right? Let's talk to Rabbi Yochanan and ask him if he does that same thing, paskins one way like this and another way like that, depending on who he's talking to, or depending on whether we're talking public policy or private dispensation. Ban Kome Rabbi Yochanan, so they asked in front of Rabbi Yochanan, At ma'at amar, what do you say? Do you also, do this sort of, in private this, in public that, or public policy this, private dispensation that? Amar lo, and he says, Ani ein li ela Mishnah. I follow the Mishnah, which, as we said, looks like Rabbi Meir. Hamaser v'amevashel b'Shabbat, somebody who tithes or cooks on Shabbos. B'shogeg yochal, if it was unwitting, they can eat it even on Shabbos. B'mezid lo yochal. If it was purposeful, they cannot eat it on Shabbos, but on Motzei Shabbos they can. Meaning, I'm not going to distinguish depending on who I'm talking to and who I'm not talking to. This is how I paskin. Okay, I paskin like Rabbi Meir, and it's mekel. So Rav Chisda hears this, and Rav Chisda is Babylonian Amora too. Shama Rav Chisda v'mar. Rav Chisda hears this and says, "Hutru Shabbatot. What are you doing? You're literally. It's like we say something is hutra. It's like now everything is permissible. You have literally untied, like lahatir is literally to untie, right? Like matir asurim, to untie those who are tied up, to release prisoners. You have untied Shabbos, meaning you have literally just allowed Shabbos to be completely hutra, like anything goes." And he explains why. I mean, it's not like he's saying anything goes. He's following Rabbi Meir. says, well, lo chen amar Rav Huna b'shem Rav. Didn't Rav Huna say this in the name of Rav? Vitani Rabbi Chia Kain, and Rabbi Chia also said the following, and he's going to tell us what the following is, but I want to give us a little bit of a sort of like a preamble to it. The case that they're about to talk about is not a case of cooking on Shabbos. It's a slightly different case. It's a case of leaving something on the stovetop before Shabbos until Shabbos comes in. Now, I want to clarify this. This is really important. It's an important area of Halakha. And for those who learned Gemara Shabbos in Daf Yomi, the third parak of Shabbos talks about this, parak Hakira. This issue is rabbinically, we are not permitted to leave food on the stovetop before Shabbos into Shabbos unless any of the following are true. Unless the food is already edible, and a discussion of what it means it's cooked until it's edible. To what degree does it have to be halfway cooked, a third way cooked, completely cooked? That's not my issue right now. But the point is, it has to be already cooked to the point that it's edible, or it has to be completely raw, or even if it's not cooked to be edible and not completely raw, the fire source, the heating element, and the switch that moves it have to be covered. Now, this is because, and again, this is not our issue, it's just to give us a sense of what we're about to read. This is because Chazal did not want people on Shabbos to want to speed up the cooking process, so they would start poking at the coals on Shabbos, thereby violating Shabbos in order to get the thing to cook faster. So if it's already edible, no one's going to be worried about doing that, right? They're not going to need to cook anymore. It's already edible. It's fine. If it's completely raw, even poking at the coals is not going to do anything. So people aren't going to be enticed to do that. They'll just wait until it'll slow cook. And that's what it is. It's a slow cook. Or if the heating element is covered, and whatever it is that sort of controls the heating element, at least in our day, right? They're also going to realize, okay, I'm not going to move the coals. But the point is, the example that we're about to see, where Rav Chisda says, from that example, we see that it isn't just what is the straight bottom line halacha, but it's how do we think people will behave. The example is not from cooking on Shabbos. The example is from leaving something on the stovetop before Shabbos. Okay, with that preamble, let's get into it. So it goes like this. Barishona, originally, Hayu Omrim, they used to say, meaning they used to rule the following way. Hashocheach tavshil al gabe kirato b'Shabbat. If somebody forgets their cooking dish, meaning the dish that's cooking, the food that's cooking, on their stovetop as Shabbos comes in, right? B'shogeg yochal. If it was an accident, they can eat, right? Sounds like Rabbi Meir. They can eat the food on Shabbos. But b'mezid, if they did it on purpose, lo yochal. They shouldn't eat it on Shabbos. Still, Rabbi Meir. That, says Rav Chisda, that was Barishonah. That was at the beginning. But then what did they see? Nechshidu, the people were suspected of what? Shahayu menichin mizidin. They would purposely put their food on the stovetop right before Shabbos. Ve'omrin, and they would say, shlichin hayinu, oops, it was an accident. Oops. They were dishonest. And therefore, v'asru lahen et hashocher. Therefore, the rabbis changed their ruling. They said, no, even somebody who forgets that dish on the stovetop before Shabbos, they can't eat it on Shabbos, right? And this, Rav Chisda, that's what he wants to see his rabbis doing. He wants to see them being extra machmir so that people don't pretend, oh, I did a b'shogeg, when they really did a b'mezid. So don't be lenient when they do a b'shogeg, because if you're lenient when they do a b'shogeg, even when they're b'mezid, they'll pretend they did a b'shogeg. People lie. That's what people do. By the way, people lie to themselves, right? So he says, Va'at amar Halakhah, and you, says Rav Chisda to Rabbi Yochanan, you're going to be so makil on mevashel b'Shabbos. I mean, this was even, they were just leaving the food on from before Shabbos. And you're going to be makil even in mevashel b'Shabbos, right? Now, he doesn't say it, but I'm thinking to myself, leaving food on before Shabbos, that's only an Isser D'Rabbanan. Bishul on Shabbos, that's an Isser D'Oraita, cooking on Shabbos. So Rav Chisda is scandalized. He's like, Rabbi Yochanan, why don't you want to be more careful? Don't give people an out that if they did something b'shogeg, they can eat on Shabbos. Don't follow Rabbi Meir. They'll lie. They'll say everything was shogeg, right? So what does Rabbi Yochanan say? Actually, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say anything. Rav Hila says something. And Rav Hila, it's so interesting. The answer could have been, look, I don't take into account what people do or not do. I'm poskening how I'm poskening based on what the halacha should be. And I trust that everybody, is going to be honest, maybe. Or maybe I don't trust, or maybe I just don't think about it at all, right? But Rav Hila doesn't say any of that, right? He doesn't say, oh, we trust people implicitly. He also doesn't say, well, you can't paskin halacha based on bad actors. He doesn't say either of those. Instead, he says, oh, no, it's totally right. In the case of leaving something on the stove beforehand, yeah. People are totally suspected about that. But in the case of Bishul, they actually won't do that, right? Take a look. I'm a Rabbi Hila. I'm actually going to make it a little bit higher. I'm a Rabbi Hila. Rabbi Hila says, Nechshedu liot manichin. People are suspected or were suspected of being willing to leave something on the stovetop before Shabbos against the rabbinic decree of doing so. But velo nechshedu liot mefashlin. They didn't think that people would cook on Shabbos against the biblical prohibition. And therefore, kansu b'meniach, they gave a penalty to the people when it comes to leaving something on the stovetop, that even if you say you did it b'shogeg, because we don't really believe you and we think people will lie and say they did it b'shogeg, you still can't eat the food on Shabbos. But velo kansu b'mevashel, when it comes to bishul, they did not give such a penalty. They did not assume that if somebody said, I did this b'shogeg, I did this by accident, meaning I didn't know it was Shabbos or I didn't know it was usher to cook on Shabbos, we believe them. We don't think people would lie about that. We don't think people would violate a d'oraita like that and lie about that. And what's interesting is that Rabbi Hila is not just saying something in the abstract. He's actually saying, like, that particular example that Rav Chisda was quoting, and saying to Rabbi Yochanan, how could you be so lenient? I mean, look at the situation where they were noticing that people were suspected of leaving something on the stovetop before Shabbos, and so they changed their ruling to be more machmir. And Rabbi Hila says, yeah, that was only about people putting things on the stovetop. It wasn't about violating Shabbos. It wasn't about cooking things on Shabbos. It was about leaving something on the stovetop before Shabbos into Shabbos that could maybe result in somebody stoking at coals, right? Which is different. These are two different things. And you could argue that in some ways what it's saying is, we don't assume that people are going to violate a d'oraita and lie about it, or at least an Isser Shabbos d'oraita and lie about it. An Isser d'Rabbanan maybe, but not an Isser Shabbos. Or you could put it a little differently, even if they're not in their minds distinguishing between a d'Rabbanan and a d'oraita. You might say, look, I can understand somebody Friday afternoon, they left something on. I did it on purpose. I did it by mistake. They're going to find some justification. But who would lie about straight up putting food on a stovetop on Shabbos? Nobody's going to do that. People have limits. They might not even think in categories of d'Rabbanan and d'oraita, but they're thinking of before Shabbos and on Shabbos. People know, right? So that's kind of an interesting next step in this conversation. Are there places where we don't trust people and places where we do trust people? Are there things that we think people would be willing to violate and things that they wouldn't be willing to violate, right? So far in our question of how much does halacha take into account people's human proclivities to maybe be dishonest, to maybe exploit, to maybe try to get a little bit extra. It seems like Rav, who said in the privacy of his own group of students, he would teach them Rabbi Meir, but in public, he would teach Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. In private, he was lenient. Public policy, he was strict. Sounds like he was basically saying, I know the people, and when I know these people, I can tell them this. And when I'm talking to the world here, and I don't know everybody in every situation, I'm going to be a little more cautious and circumspect. Then we have this example with Rav Hila, which is his way of explaining Rabbi Yochanan, which is, look, there are certain things about which the average person might be a little dishonest. But there are certain things where we assume that the average person is completely honest. And so it's less about, is it this person who I'm talking to or that person who I'm talking to? And it's more about, well, what is the issue in question? I don't think people are dishonest about everything. I don't think people are exploitative about everything. Some things, yes, some things, no. Now, when you look at the Bavli and Chulin, and with this we're going to end, you find a third approach. And, these are all connected to each other, of course, right? Is it these people or those people? Is it the this violation or that violation, right? And the Bavli and Chulin on Tedvav, it also has a version of, is it this people or those people? But instead of it being what I teach my students versus what I say to the tzibor, there's a different kind of concern here, which is a concern that comes up in various ways in the Bavli. Va'amar Rav Chanan bar Ami, didn't Rav Chanan bar Ami say, Ki mori lahu Rav letalmidei, when Rav taught his students, right? This is it's a different version of what we saw in the Yerushalmi. Mori lahu ka Rabbi Meir, he would rule to them like Rabbi Meir, the most mekil. But chidarish b'pirka, and when he would teach in the public teaching session on Shabbos, darish ka Rabbi Yehuda, he would teach like Rabbi Yehuda, a little bit more machmir. Now notice, it's not Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, the most machmir, but it's a little bit more machmir, right? So why is this that he would do that? And the Gemara answers, mishum amei haaretz. Because of, I've used the term the hoi polloi here. Amei haaretz, however, are not just the hoi polloi. They're not just the public. They are particular people in the worldview of Chazal, and especially Babylonian Amoraim, who are known to be lax on Halakha. Perhaps they don't always give their maser. Perhaps they don't do the mitzvah of wearing tefillin. Perhaps they don't say Kriyat Shema. Perhaps they don't serve Talmidei Chachamim, so they don't find out how people practice. They just have sort of the on the books, quote unquote. Not that there were too many books then, but on the books. But the point is, there's a particular group of people who supposedly Rav is looking at and saying, I want these people to think that we're more machmir on this, right? It's going to keep them from becoming more mekel. Now, I look at this as a little bit different than just what he taught in public versus what he taught in private, or how he ruled in public versus how he ruled in private, because when I see that there's a particular group of people, the Amei Haaretz, which is a particular group of people who he has in mind, I wonder if that's a group that's, more of a subset of the tzibor, and actually he has more grounding to think that they're going to be lax, right? Because he knows that they are, right? That's how they're known already. So it's kind of an interesting thing. What I think is great is that for the most part, Halakha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Halakha follows Rabbi Yehuda. There are a few people, the Vilna Gaon and their Balei HaTosfot, who paskin like Rabbi Meir, but for the most part, it's Rabbi Yehuda, the middle of the road. And I just think it's wonderful to see that even though the Mishnayot in their anonymous layer, Rabbi Meir, sound like Rabbi Meir, even though Rav wanted to paskin or would paskin privately like Rabbi Meir, even though Rabbi Yochanan wanted us to follow Rabbi Meir, even so, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. The Bavli tries to read the Mishnah in Chulin, Aleph, like Rabbi Yehuda. And perhaps we are taking into account here the need to keep in mind that sometimes when you give people an inch, they take a foot. Maybe. Thanks, everyone.